Welcome back to our reading of Jesus, Dead or Alive. Poor lighting. In 1907, the British scholar Curzap Lake came up with another ingenious suggestion. Unlike the advocates of the swoon theory, he accepted that Jesus died and was buried as the record says. The Bible tells us that on the first Sunday morning, 3 women went to the tomb to complete the embalming of the body at early dawn, Luke 24:1. But on reading this, Lake had a novel idea. Emotionally disturbed and in poor light, the women lost their way and went to the wrong tomb. At first glance, this seems possible, but the idea falls apart as soon as we give it a moment's thought. It is one thing to suppose that 3 distraught women took a wrong turn in poor light, but this would not account for what happened later. When they went back into the city and told the disciples, Peter and John ran to the tomb to see for themselves. Did they also go to the wrong tomb in broad daylight? Later, one of the Marys returned. Did she get it wrong again? The other women also returned later. Did they repeat their earlier mistake? What is more, rumors of a resurrection would have spread like wildfire. Are we really to believe that on Sunday morning, people were scurrying all over the cemetery looking for one open grave, and that none of them could find the right one? One other thing. Why did nobody ask Joseph, the owner of the tomb? Is it conceivable that he would carefully choose his own private burial place, lay a dear friend's body in it, and then forget where it was? Even if this were so, the Jewish authorities who had hounded Jesus to death would have been more than happy to point people in the right direction. Apparently brushing all of this aside, Curzap Lake then plays fast and loose with the biblical record, which tells us that the women were met by an angel. With no evidence whatever, Lake says it was not an angel but a cemetery caretaker who told the women, "You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth. He is not here." This would fit the wrong tomb idea, but Lake omits the crucial words the Bible adds. He has risen. His theory is based on attributing the first part of the angel's statement to a caretaker, then deliberately leaving out the rest. He changes the meaning of the message, but only by dishonestly tampering with the text. Another issue helps to destroy Lake's myth. 2 of the women had been present at the burial of Jesus just 36 hours earlier and saw where Jesus was laid. Mark 15:47. The word translated saw here refers to a person who looks with interest and for a purpose, usually indicating the careful observation of details. Bearing that in mind, would both Marys have forgotten where they had looked so carefully? Lake tries to counter this. Quote, "It is very doubtful if they were close to the tomb at the moment of the burial. It is likely that they were watching at a distance," unquote. Yet once again he is clutching at straws, as the Bible carefully adds the words that the women saw the tomb and how his body was laid. Luke 23:55. How could they possibly have seen this from a distance? Again, Lake tries to have his cake and eat it, using some of the biblical text, but chopping out the bits that contradict his theory. This particular lake holds no water. Grave robbers. Other ideas center on the general theory that at some time between Friday evening and Sunday morning, the body of Jesus was removed from the tomb. This would explain why it was empty when the women got there early on Sunday morning. But was the grave robbed? 4 suggestions have been made. The first is that the body was stolen by a person or persons unknown, but nobody has come up with either motive or opportunity for this, let alone explain how they could have overcome an armed Roman guard. As for a motive, Jesus was not a wealthy man who might have valuable items buried with him. The evidence pointed in exactly the opposite direction. The Bible also tells us that the grave clothes were there left in the tomb, which means that all that was taken was a naked corpse. Why should anyone do this? As Sir J.N.D. Anderson, professor of Oriental law at the University of London, has said, a Jew of that period could scarcely be suspected of stealing bodies on behalf of anatomical research. The second suspects are the Roman authorities. They had an exclusive opportunity, as they were in charge of the tomb and its contents, But what motive could they have had? Nervous about the possibility of some strange goings-on, Pilate had insisted on maximum security, with an armed guard and his own seal. Tampering with it would have meant execution. What could be gained by moving the body elsewhere? Pilate wanted to wash his hands of the case as soon as possible, and did so literally. See Matthew 27:24. So why would he want the body back? This idea collapses for another reason. If the Roman authorities had the body, they would immediately have produced it when the disciples began preaching that Jesus was alive, and the Christian church would have collapsed on the spot. The third suggestion is that the body was removed by the Jewish religious authorities. They would certainly have had a powerful motive, as Jesus had staked his integrity and identity on fulfilling his prophecy that he would be killed and after 3 days rise again, Mark 8:31. All they had to do was to keep the body under lock and key for 4 days, and the whole Jesus movement would be laughed out of court with its leader exposed as a blasphemous fake. Why did they not do this? When the disciples began preaching the resurrection of Jesus, the Jews had them arrested, imprisoned, flogged, and executed, all of which would have been unnecessary if they had a body to produce. They could have even paraded it through the streets. As the Scottish theologian Professor Andrew Fairbairn has said, the silence of the Jews is as significant as the speech of the Christians. The last suspects are Jesus' own disciples, but it is difficult to find either a motive or opportunity for them. Their leader's body had been buried in the tomb of a follower who was a respected member of the council, Mark 15:43. Why should they want to move it elsewhere? Opportunity is even more difficult to imagine. When Jesus was arrested, his followers all left him and fled, Mark 14:50. And when he was executed, they hid behind locked doors for fear of the Jews, John 20:19, terrified that they might be next on their hit list. Can we seriously imagine that this panic-stricken rabble suddenly plucked up the courage to go to the tomb, tackle an armed guard, and risk the death penalty by breaking the governor's official seal on the rock, all for the purpose of taking possession of a dead body that was already in the safekeeping of a fellow Christian? If they did, why is there no record of them being charged with such serious offenses? The idea that the disciples stole the body faces at least two other problems. The first is ethical. These men had been powerfully influenced by Jesus, and their lives had been transformed. As one of them was to write later, a person wanting to enjoy God's blessing on his life should keep his tongue from evil and his lips from speaking deceit, 1 Peter 3:10. It is inconceivable that men whose moral standards had been elevated to a level that they had never known before should now base their entire teaching on a pack of lies they knew they had invented. The second is psychological. Soon after the resurrection, this handful of faithless and dejected men became a dynamic and fearless band of believers prepared to face persecution, imprisonment, and execution rather than deny their convictions. When they were threatened with this kind of treatment and given strict instructions to stop preaching the resurrection of Jesus, they replied, "We must obey God rather than men," Acts 5:29, and carried on preaching. It was this transformation that convinced Charles Colson that the resurrection record was true. Colson was the chief counsel to the United States President Richard Nixon from 1969 through 1973, and was deeply involved in the Nixon administration's burglary of the Democratic Party's Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. on June 17, 1972. The administration tried to cover up the crime, but in less than a month after criminal proceedings began, 3 of those involved had gone to the Department of Justice to turn state evidence. Sometime later, Colson wrote, "In my Watergate experience, I saw the inability of men, powerful, highly motivated professionals, to hold together a conspiracy based on a lie. Yet Christ's followers maintained to their grim deaths by execution that they had in fact seen Jesus Christ raised from the dead. There was no conspiracy. Men do not give up comfort, and certainly not their lives, for what they know to be a lie." This is hugely important. People may sometimes be willing to die for something they believe to be true, and countless fanatics have done so. But nobody is prepared to die for something they know to be false.